Child and adolescent behavioral health welcomes you to another great episode of our Health, Hope, and Happiness podcast brought to you by Stifel. I'm your host, the Director of Marketing for Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health, Dan Mucci, and today we're joined once again by GlenOak High School athletic trainer Alex Shaheen. Alex is returning to discuss an important topic for both athletes and fitness enthusiasts alike on how to properly recover after a workout. So, as always, we welcome Alex back to the program. It's great to have him here. Before we begin part one of this series, I'd like to share a little bit more information about our guest. Alex teaches sports medicine at GlenOak High School and serves as an adjunct professor at Kent State University. On a personal note, Alex taught my daughter when she attended GlenOak High School sports medicine, and he also helped both of my kids as they had some injuries throughout their athletic careers here at GlenOak. I know firsthand the knowledge and passion he brings to helping young athletes stay healthy, and you're going to experience some of that enthusiasm today. Today's conversation is centered on high school athletes, but the principles we'll discuss apply to anyone who exercises, whether you're training for a sport, headed to the gym a few days a week, or simply trying to live a healthier lifestyle. So let's dive in. So Alex, before we talk about recovery, let's talk about what happens ahead of time. So many athletes, even myself actually working out, will use a supplement such as creatine or a beetroot powder as part of their training routine. So what do these supplements do? How do they benefit you if they do? And are there any misconceptions about that people should know?
So when you're talking about taking a supplement to help you do work, we've put that under a umbrella category of an ergogenic aid. So just working out is like a physiological ergogenic aid. If I'm exercising and you're not, that gives me an advantage over you in terms of performance, right? Like, so if I'm training, that's an ergogenic aid. So these would be, supplements that we would take as ergogenic aids. Ergo means to do work. Gen means to produce work. So we're producing more work. Creatine is probably one of the most widely studied and in terms of its performance, efficacious supplements you can take. It's studied a lot in adults, so we know what it does. Okay, so it's going to increase that intramuscular phosphocreatine, which is what we're going to be using for our immediate short-term explosive exercise. So, you think your bench presses, your broad jumps, any sport where you're going to be doing quick work. Okay, so it's not going to be really beneficial for those trying to increase their aerobic capacity. So things like swimming and distance running. But if you're taking it for a pre-workout 3 to 5 grams a day, you're probably going to see benefits if you're going to do strength training or sprinting in that effect. So there's a lot of good studies out there. We talked about this previously where creatine got this bad misconception where it affected your kidney health. There were a couple cases, not widespread, of creatine abuse. So anytime you take something that's not taken for the right effect, and also there were some other factors because those athletes were wrestlers who were using it. So they were also cutting weight. They were severely dehydrated and they suffered some kidney issues. So using creatine is going to help you do the work. It's not going to get you, it's not a steroid. It's not going to make your muscles, grow faster. You might retain some water weight. In order to store creatine, you got to get some water in there. So your muscles are going to absorb more water. So they might look a little bit bigger, but you'll lose that water weight, eventually. So there's not a lot of good research saying the contrary, that it affects your kidney health adversely. There's not a lot of research saying that it impacts hydration. So creatine does what it says it does. The 3 supplements that I say are pretty well studied, that we know what they do: creatine, caffeine, protein. Okay, those three things, those three supplements are well studied. One thing you want to make sure that if you're taking a supplement, that it is third party endorsed. So third party being it's the FDA can't touch supplements. Okay, so they're not going to give a seal of approval, but NSF, USP, these are going to be just seals that are on there that say, oh, we sent this to a lab, it was tested by somebody other than our company, and it says that it doesn't have any banned substances in it. So I would say for athletes, especially at the collegiate level, that's something that you want to think about. Beetroot powder, we don't have as much information about. There's some thought that it converts nitric oxide, making it more available for oxygen into the muscles, so it should help a little bit with recovery. Not a magic bullet, but when we talk about perceived soreness and recovery, there could be some improvement there with inflammation in those athletes who are doing a lot of work. So we'll talk about the importance of inflammation as we go on in this conversation. But creatine, to me, for a consenting adult who wants to take a supplement, I think is fine. Now, I get a lot of parents who ask me, like, so my son wants to go on creatine. I think that's dependent on where they're at in their athletic journey and what kind of athlete they are, and where they're at in development. I think in pediatrics we don't have a lot of good studies because they just don't do them on pediatrics. But you talk about a 17 or 18-year-old kid in high school, it's probably worth the conversation of looking into it.
Nice. So now we talked about the pre-workout. Assuming we worked out, assuming we stayed well hydrated during our workout, once the workout is over, what is the very first step in the recovery process?
So something I always kind of harp on athletes that we work with, and we're going to be going into the throes of 2-a-days where it's going to be hot, is how are you replenishing the fluids you lost? How do you know how much fluid you lost? So two very simple, efficient ways to monitor hydration after an exercise is knowing how much you weighed going into the workout and how much you weighed going out of the workout. And you could replace that fluid volume. We want to try to go, let's say you lost 2 pounds. All right. So 2 pounds is going to be 32 ounces. We want to try to shoot kind of above that. So we're going to be trying to replenish it about 1.5 times of whatever the volume is lost. So a simple way to say is I say every pound you lose, try to drink a bottle of water or a 24-ounce drink. If you have I know there's always the flavor of the month for whatever students are using as their drinking receptacles, whether it's an Owala or a Stanley. Fill that up every pound you lose. Make sure that you're trying to get some fluids in you. Doesn't have to always be water. Okay, so a sports drink is fine, but you want to replenish those. That way, you're getting the nutrients to the body. A lot of our vitamins are traveled through water, and making sure that we're making sure that our tissues have the proper amount of water. Another thing that I think is overlooked is what's your carbohydrate intake like? Okay, so we look at in my nutrition course that I teach, I often get a lot of students overemphasizing the importance of protein for performance. Protein is important for recovery, and I think that there's a lot to be said for taking a protein supplement if you need it, but making sure that you're intaking the proper amount of carbohydrates. So like somebody who is trying to change their body composition or lose weight, they might put the hex on carbohydrates and not try to take in as many carbohydrates. And I think for an athlete, that's not a really the right approach. There's some commercial marketed drinks that are low sugar, and that's fine. I think the daily intake of somebody who is not going through rigorous exercise probably shouldn't be intaking a ton of sugar. But some of those athletes will need those sugars to be replaced. So, thinking about your carbohydrate intake, and when you do a workout, we store sugars in our body. A lot of people think, oh, I intake too much sugar. It's going to be converted to fat. But within a lot of athletes, we're more concerned about replenishing glycogen. And glycogen is energy that we store from sugar in our muscles and in our liver. And we use that for athletic activity. So when we do a workout, a strenuous workout, we're depleting that glycogen and, making sure we're replenishing those sugars as we need them. You think about a cross-country team doing that carbo loading. They go on a workout. Our cross-country team has a pasta dinner, and they all eat a ton of pasta. And those are complex carbohydrates that are going to be stored in the body. And then in the immediate, we talk about a cool down. Cool down doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out thing. There is some evidence that shows that it helps a little bit with clearing that blood lactate, getting the heart back down to a normal level. So, that could be something as simply as walking and then doing some light stretching. Does not have to be a huge routine, just something to get the body back down to a steady state to try to help. So bottom line is hydrate, eat, and, passive recovery, which, we don't have to do all sorts of gizmos and gadgets to be able to get the body back down to a resting state.
Great. So you kind of touched on refueling the body, and we're going to discuss this a little bit more. So everyone exercises at different times of the day depending on their schedule, whether that's a student, an adult, a college student, whatever the case may be. Nutrition does play a major role in recovery, which you touched on. What should someone be eating after a workout? So usually when I come home, I make myself a protein shake, put some protein powder in it, some peanut butter, Greek yogurt, whatever. Is that really a good strategy, or what other foods should athletes or just anybody working out be considering after a workout to replenish their body?
So you and I aren't the only people on a podcast right now talking about supplements and recovery. So there's a lot of information out there, and there's a big talk about like, what window do you need to be taking this? We don't really have a good established window, but I would say like as long as you're within those first 2 hours, but some people will say even up to 6 hours, as long as you're getting something in, that's going to be helpful for recovery. So when it comes to protein, okay, daily intake is going to be different than post-workout. So the American College of Sports Medicine recommends about 0.25 to 0.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. Not a lot of people know their body weight in kilograms, though. So I would say a good rule of thumb is, whatever you weigh. So if you weigh 180 pounds, okay, if you were to convert that, it would be like 11 to 14 percent of your pounds. So, if you weigh if you weigh 180 pounds, you drop that zero off down to 10%, you get 18 grams. That's probably going, if you shoot for that, that's probably going to be enough. So let's say you take your protein shakes probably around 20 to 25 grams. You could probably be in a good shape up to weighing, 250 pounds. You weigh over 250 pounds, maybe you're going to be intaking more, but usually that protein is going to be covered by that protein shake, right? Same thing with carbohydrates. So we're going to be looking at post-workout. Again, people neglect the importance of carbs in terms of replenishing after activity. So especially for our athletes, we want to get about 1 to 1.2, depending on the extent of the exercises, grams per kilogram of body weight. Okay. So we look at high carbohydrate foods, complex foods. We're talking rice, potatoes, bread, even fruit can be beneficial to replenish those glycogen stores, that stored sugar that's in our body that we use for fuel. Okay. So in that post-recovery period, we look at 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate for the body, and 10 to 20 grams of protein. So basically half your weight in grams of carbohydrates, and then about 10 to 15% of your weight in protein. A lot of people use that 3-to-1 ratio of, if you're getting 60 grams of carbohydrates, you should have about 20 grams of protein. I think that's a reasonable place to start. I would not fret on the details of, 1 or 2 grams here or there. If you're really worried about pinching pennies and making sure you're getting the most out of every serving, maybe you'd be concerned about that. But, I know chocolate milk is one that a lot of people would like to use because it's pretty affordable per serving and it has that good ratio. But I would say once you're getting into those, those bodybuilding, powerlifting type of workouts, and you weigh, over 250 pounds, then you're probably going to need to supplement more. And, I think that's really a good starting point is how much do you weigh, and then go from there of what you're getting in your body. And I don't think it has to be a crazy overload of protein and carbs. I think you could probably find a shake that you could add a banana or, have a scoop of oatmeal to, and you're going to be in good shape for that recovery window.
So that brings me to a question, is in follow-up question, as you were rattling off body weight and grams, like as an adult, I don't even know all that. So our high school athletes probably don't know all that. So I think we touched on this in a prior podcast. Are you teaching coaches this? Are you holding, like, when the football team's in the weight room, are you doing like a class before they start their like summer lifting or off-season program, so they know? You said parents, sometimes come up and ask you questions. Are we educating the parents like at all? Like, so what's that look like? Like, you just rattled off so much information that was good, but most people are probably sitting here thinking like, oh my gosh, like I don't know all this stuff.
I think so. I do have to be careful because I'm not a dietitian. Okay, so all the information I'm going to give you is broad based. So that's why I can give you those numbers and you can figure out. But you're right. Some people are not what I would say nutritionally literate in terms of like looking at a nutrition facts label. So I think there's 2 things you need to be able to recognize, and this is what coaches will have me come in and talk about fueling the body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we always try to mechanize things. So like if the body is a car, you want to make sure it's properly fueled before you go on the road trip, right? So we talk about nutrition literacy, and I think there's really 2 things you need to look at. Okay, is grams of carbohydrate per serving. So if you look at a Gatorade bottle, a 32-ounce Gatorade bottle, that's probably 2 servings of Gatorade, maybe 4 servings of Gatorade. I haven't really checked lately, but it might be 4 8-ounce servings. So you need to do some multiplication there and multiply it by 4 if you're going to drink the whole bottle. So you look at grams of carbohydrates and grams of protein. And I think those are going to be the biggest things you're going to be looking at when we're talking about recovery, not talking about whole diet, but when we talk about recovery. I'm not plugging anything, but I think the Gatorade Sports Science Institute has some really simple calculations that you can do. If you know your body weight, you can probably figure out what you need to consume. And if you're able to count and do basic arithmetic, you're going to be able to figure that out. So I would say that's probably the most important literacy factor we have is, can you look at a nutrition label? Can you identify where the grams of carbohydrates are? Not percentages, not daily percentages, but the grams in the food and the grams of protein, and then go from there. We don't need to get in the weeds of whether it's a complex or a complete protein yet. I think if you can shoot for that, you can properly fuel the body, especially for our athletes who are doing a lot of work. They're going to be burning that fuel pretty quick. We're not talking about dieting and weight loss. We're talking about recovery. So, it's going to be fuel in, fuel out pretty quick.
Thank you for clarifying that and make it a little bit easier for our listeners to understand. So there's a term out there called load management. It seems pretty common in the sports world. Can you explain a little bit more what that means and why it's such an important part of preventing injuries and maybe looking at the improved long-term performance?
So load management kind of becomes a dirty word when you're talking about professional sports, because you have these multi-million dollar athletes. People are shelling out good money to see them, and they're sitting and they're resting because we want to manage their volume. But when you're talking about an economic investment like that, I don't know, if I was paying a guy that much money, I'd want him to be healthy for the playoffs too. So but that's not what the podcast is about, right? So if we're talking about load management in pediatric athletes, one of the biggest issues that I've seen in my 15 years as an athletic trainer that's changed from over the past decade is the amount of sports specialization I see at a young age. Students who are playing sports year round, doing one movement repetitively over and over again. And, that's where we see a lot of the overuse injuries, okay, that come into play. So we look at external load on the body and how much the body can withstand. So the American College of Sports Medicine and the American Academy of Pediatrics, they come out with some figures here. So we don't want to do more than 16 hours in a week of training. Okay.
Sure.
And one thing we look at with pediatrics is it probably shouldn't be any more than their age. So that's a simple way to look at it. How many hours of training are you doing versus how old is this person? We have growth plates that are still working on ossifying. We have young women who are going through different body changes at certain times in their life that could create a higher risk of injury. So we look at a sports training, I don't want to throw too much math at anybody, but we want to look at what have you done over the past 4 weeks, and then what are you doing this week? And does that average out to be about normal? Okay. So if you're doing, mileage is really simple to do. Okay. So if you are doing mileage at, 20 miles a week, okay, and all of a sudden you're going to increase that mileage that week to 30, 35 miles. Okay. Once we get over that 1.5 tot ratio where you're doing more than what you've been doing the past 4 weeks. So in a month, take a look at what you're doing in terms of pitches, mileage, whatever external load you're putting on the body. Okay. So volume wise, even if it's, total volume of weight that you're lifting, right? If it's going to be increased by over 10%, it's probably going to be something that would put you at a higher risk of injury. Okay. We shouldn't really be increasing loads over 20%, definitely. But that 10% management is usually pretty reasonable. Okay. So we talk about acute to chronic workload ratio. So over a month, take what you've done each week, average that out by 4. Okay. So what are you averaging? And then this week, what are you doing? And if it's increased, then you know that you're probably putting yourself at risk for higher injury. And we see this all the time with, athletes coming in from summer into a training program. They're supposed to be doing their mileage during the summer. It's easy to say, yeah, I ran, but you don't really know what the effort was or how often they were able to do it. And now all of a sudden they're putting in this mileage. We see an increase of overuse injuries during that time. So, you want to make sure that you are doing that. And now with technology, it's never been easier to do that. If you have a smartwatch that tracks your GPS, it's going to be able to tell you your workload ratio. We do this with our soccer teams. We put GPS trackers on their back. You'll see Soccer players run anywhere from 3.5 to 4 miles in a game.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're putting that load on there, and anytime you're putting more games in a week, we probably need to make sure that we're resting on those off days a little bit more. Um, so pitch counts in baseball is another one. So making sure that you're staying within that range, even if you're below your normal pitch count threshold, like for that age group. Is this person throwing more pitches than they have been in these past couple weeks? If you have a complete game pitched and it's the most pitches you've thrown over the course of the month, you expect to be pretty sore. So you might need a little bit more time for recovery. And that's really all load management is it's another metric that we use to track and try to get an idea of how much we're working this particular athlete.
That wraps up another terrific episode of the Health, Hope, and Happiness podcast brought to you by Stifel. Again, my name is Dan Mucci. I'm the Director of Marketing, and a special thank you to Alex Shaheen for joining us today and sharing his knowledge on how proper recovery can help people perform better, stay healthier, and reduce injury. Again, this was part one of our two-part episode. So thank you for listening. And until the next time, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and keep finding your path to happiness.